So, Matt, what are we talking about today?
So we're talking about DC's All In, The New Gods, #2. It's a recent sort of reboot of the classic New Gods storyline. This one's written by Rom V. So we've got a continuation of the first issue. We've got, I believe is it Mr. Miracle? So we've got like fatherhood themes, and he's struggling with his duty to save this unknown godchild versus raising his own child. So there's interesting kind of family dynamic stuff there. Uh, there's some strange uh, dastardly forces that are converging on Earth and Apocalypse, driven by this godchild phenomenon, the prophecy about the chaos that this child would bring, and so there's a lot of interesting. That's my broad understanding. With Darkseid being dead, and there's more gods who might become unalived after this. The gods. These new gods are trying to secure their destiny, and they're trying to navigate family and sacrifice in light of that, in light of this new impending forces. It's very, it's that's me working really hard in reading this actually 3 times to make sure I understand it, because I understand that this is hallowed ground in a sense for DC. This particular story, uh, this particular classic story, and for them to represent it here, uh, there's a lot of challenges, I imagine. And I think we're going to get right into that, aren't we? So, Twitless, what do you what do you think? What's your hot take?
Well, I get the hot take here,
Oh,
but
yeah, that's right. That's right.
because I'm the hot one on this panel.
Yes.
But fired up by this comic. Yeah, I applaud you, Matt, for teasing out a common thread because as I was reading it, yeah, I mean, there's elements of what you said, family and legacy, and preserving what comes after.
Mm,
But a lot of the comic, like it's doing an ensemble of storylines, and it ends up feeling like comic chop suey. There's just so many pieces thrown in there uh, that maybe together, kind of work as a dish, but individually are not all that engaging or interesting. The Mr. Miracle storyline takes way too long, where he's saying goodbye to his family just to have Big Bertha kind of show up and be like, "Where do you think you're going? Shrimp."
All right, I gotta correct you. It's Barda.
Barda, sorry.
Big
Jeez.
Bertha.
Tell me she didn't
You're
look
on
like a Big
diaper
Bertha
duty.
to me.
That's
Gulp.
funny. That's
Yeah.
funny.
Metron is there, for reasons, and the other thing is like this whole new god baby. You're just told it's an important, uh, you know, story point, but you're not really. There's nothing really shown to explain
Well,
why.
it says it's implied it's Darkseid. That's
It's
what.
implied,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's.
I was
I mean,
wondering about that. Yeah.
but the setting is like, it's just a kid growing up in India, and something to do with like whether or not it gets lost at a temple. I mean, there's all this other window dressing around it that doesn't really forebode and foreshadow something as ominous as it actually being dark side. I would have liked to have actually set a little bit of tone there to lead it into something like that, so give a little bit more interest. And yeah, the other aspect, the other thread that I did like is this one character, the assassin, who's seems to be intent on killing this baby. So that was one characteristic that I did like that was thrown into this meal. Um,
Mhm.
I liked that character. I like the setup. He doesn't seem to be he seems to be of a lower class, a lower stature than all the other characters here, because they are all essentially gods. And
Are you talking about the warlord Karok Death Speaker? Is that the one? Yeah.
yeah. Thank you for helping me with that name. That name was chop suey. Uh, and I like what's happening on Apocalypse, although that doesn't really seem to be going anywhere immediately. But
Hmm.
just seeing that there is a conflict there, and the elements that are taking over a little bit does lend to some potential storytelling in the future. So as you can see from my description, there's just a lot happening and none of it really happening with any urgency and not a single piece standing out particularly to really anchor you to the story to carry you forward.
Let's take a brief pause to hear from the awesome creators joining us today and find out what cool projects they're currently working on.
Hey guys, if you love sword and sandal historical fiction with a healthy dose of ancient Roman and Egyptian fantasy mixed in, then check out Kyrie. We've got 450 pages printed so far and a fourth book on the way. Order your books today at curiecomic.com.
Modern day, classic superhero storytelling. Get The Adventures of Omega Girl, issues 1 through 5, now on Indie Planet.
Thank you to our awesome creators, and now back to the video.
So, I'm not going to be one of the ones who overestimates, I guess, the new gods. I think the fourth world is interesting. I've also always had a hard time uh getting very invested in it as a whole, as opposed to the pieces that have been often plucked out of it to be put into DC canon, right? Darkseid's a cool villain and he's been used to great effect for a long time in multiple mediums. But when you bring the whole of the fourth world into it's we were talking about this in a previous video with Nameless, check it out, where we have Grant Morrison, this guy who pretends to be a shaman who kind of has a buffet of things he's just putting together. Kirby's kind of doing the same thing, but it's far more innocent. Kirby's like, oh, I want to make my own sort of like, can I, as an artist who's very visionary, can I invent a mythology out of thin air? Can I just make up, my own pantheon of deities and demigods and give them a science fiction origin as opposed to a more supernatural, preternatural one? And so, it's so he has the pantheon, and they all tend to represent something, but as opposed to being tied specifically to um, supernatural things that can't be explained, it was like, here's the atomic energy that you are associated with, Orion, and here is the Omega effect that you have, Dark Side. And so he's basically creating a mythology through the eyes of atomic science, which is something that came about in around the time that Kirby was alive. Conceptually, it's fascinating, and it leads to some very interesting things that have seeped into our zeitgeist, into our minds. Things like the Mother Box, and I remember it was a comic book professional recently who said that everyone thought the Mother Box was crazy in decades past. This box you would talk to and it talked back to you, but then everyone has smartphones nowadays, so in a way, it was presaging what we ended up getting. At the same time, you end up with just some really weird, wonky things with like the Forever People, and we have a character uh, from the Forever People here, and he's got a cowboy hat, and it's just like, what's his deal? And there's just, for everything that's interesting about the fourth world, um, there ends up being a bunch of stuff that's just wonky and weird and doesn't work. Um, and I'm probably going to step on people's toes with this because there are some people who love the fourth world, but it's like, Mantis, and it's like, okay, what's his deal? And it's like, well, he's almost as powerful as Darkseid. And it's like, I've almost never, no one's heard of this character, and most people don't care about him, and he looks ridiculous. And there's that was Jack Kirby when he made this whole pantheon, and there's certain things would click and certain things would be cool. Metron in his chair is an awesome image. This knowledge god who has this cosmic chair. The source wall is great. But I've always felt weird when you're looking at Highfather, and it's like, he's got his little shepherd's crook. He looks like they're trying to do a messianic thing with him, but not exactly. And DC never knows what to do with that character. And in this story, they're trying to make him a little less of the embodiment of good because he sends Orion to go kill this baby. So, all that to say, I don't know what to make of the New Gods. I've never known exactly what to make of the New Gods as a whole. There have been some interesting things, some seeds that I think are really cool. I always think the New Gods are more interesting in theory than in practice.
It's interesting. It makes me wonder if maybe this kind of modest renovation of the New Gods lore with tying in stronger kind of human level themes about family and fatherhood in particular, and that kind of programmed element that might help maybe, so that it's not just a lore dump every issue. Because every time I've heard people talk about classic New Gods, I mean, granted, a lot of mainstream comics just sounds like a lore dump when asked for a summary of it, but I know it's not often. Reading it can feel like a different experience. I, that's still my impression of the one from the '70s. So I wonder if it actually kind of needs like a through line that feels a lot more domestic, so that we've got something to anchor to while they're explaining all these entirely new
So,
characters that are complex relationships
well,
and just kind
it's
of
it's
throwing that at us.
it's funny because the original was actually more mundane, actually, because it's like
Mm,
they set up the cosmic conflict with Darkseid and Highfather, and then in
mhm.
I think it's the first issue of New Gods from the 1970s or whatever, and Orion just walks into Darkseid in like an apartment because there's Darkseid's just on Earth, and he's in somebody's apartment, and you're
Some
seeing like,
flat in London.
and it's like you're seeing these gods in this completely like mundane context, and it's like I had to do a double take. I was like, because they've made Darkseid just such a final boss in his throne room, and he's so removed on Apocalypse, and he's often so removed from the Earth context, and he's just like, "Sup, Orion," and it's like it was just
Just
like
doing some dishes.
it was just so weird, and I just and it that so like the original New Gods when they made the series of it, it was they actually tried to do that, and then like or Orion ended up just like getting a civilian identity and just like mixing it up with a group of human beings, and like it read like a his work on the Fantastic Four.
Mhm.
It was interesting how mundane the New Gods ended up kind of it set up the initial
That's
like
fair.
the initial pitch is this Ragnarok that led to the Twilight of the Gods, and then here's the New Gods, and then it was like apartment building New York City, because that's where it has to end up. Or it was so it's what's to kind of address your point. In some respects, this comic is very much in tune with that classic New God spirit, and I think that is a benefit and also a uh, something that holds it back. But it's been something I think because the New Gods has always struggled as a series to have longevity. Because the series I think have never had like a long run where it's like, hey, this went for 50 issues. It's always I think struggled, and
Mm.
I think part of the reason why it struggles is because it's a weird bird. What do you do with it? And I think some people really it clicks with them really well, and I think for other people they're just like, what am I doing with this? What is this
Yeah,
thing?
some people love New Gods.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I
And
see why. I can kind of see why, but I can also see why you wouldn't see that.
aesthetically, it's interesting. I mean, they have these powers and they're all kind of distinct, and you could see them, in a big confrontation, and why that would be fun. I agree that there isn't much to anchor them in terms of something grounded thematically or emotionally. You could be right, Matt, about the argument that they're trying to play on the theme of legacy and offspring. There was also it's so forgettable because there's so many storylines happening here, but there was a business guy in this book as well, and he was telling the story of how his father killed himself, and he was religious, and he's actually also hunting for this new god's baby who might be dark side. So there are a lot of references to parentage and lineage and what we derive from our parents. But I just because it's doing the New Gods thing that Twitless is mentioning, where you have to have this big ensemble of characters that get their own little storylines, their own little focal points. Orion is constantly in a fight every single issue so far, and it's never clear who he's fighting, why he's fighting, but he's got to be shown fighting for some reason. And
Yeah.
so it has to somehow interweave a more grounded emotionally narrative into New God style storytelling. um, it's a tough sell so far. I'm not. The art is getting me there. It helps a lot, honestly. I
Mhm.
quite enjoy a lot of the visuals in this book, but the storyline, it's really hard to latch on to a particular aspect of it to carry you through much of the read.
And again, I think that's something the New Guns have struggled with. I think always when they're in their own series. I think people like the New Gods when they're a flavor that gets added onto other DC properties. I think
Mm.
people really like. I think people really like Darkseid as an antagonist. I think he's a really great, final boss, as it were. Um, I think the story with Orion or Calabac, some of those, I think it's like a Metron,
Yeah.
Desaad, um, and Granny Goodness. Some of those characters, I think get used quite a bit because they're either very interesting, they have very strong dynamics, or they're just really bizarre. Like I said, Granny Goodness is just a bizarre character. I think people just get fascinated with how bizarre she is in some respects. So, but again, when you try to have that in its own book as the focus and not just the thing that's maybe steals the show, there's some if you've seen like the Black Racer, there's some weird stuff in New Gods. You
Mhm.
got this guy, and he's the personification of death, but he literally has like skis. He has like space skis. He just skis across space. He's like this. It's like the idea of Silver Surfer, but it was like, what's the other thing I can do that's not a surfer? And it was like, well, I can get a guy and have him just ski
Ski.
in space, and that's the Black Racer, and he's treated deadly serious because if he touches you, you die. He's the embodiment of death, and he looks utterly ridiculous. So like the New Gods is this really experimental thing, and I think it's so kitschy that I think that's one of the reasons some people really just love it. But for like I said, for every note, for every Metron, where it's like, man, this thing is just Kirby's genius on display. You get a Black
Mm.
Racer, and it's just like, what the hell is
Mm.
that?
Only one who's ever done it right was Walt Simonson, in my opinion.
Hmm. There's little moments. Just to give my concluding thoughts. There's some little moments that are it just feels a little telling in this issue and in the first issue where I don't know if it's the title, I don't know if it's the legacy, I don't know if it's the Herculean task of trying to have a consistent, like a clear through line straight from the start and in every issue. But there's a lot in this issue that is just like it's a visual collage that's just alluding. They're like, trust us. All these characters have backstories and interesting moments in their history, and we're just gonna allude to that with this pastiche, a visual pastiche of like, here's these little action moments of this, all these characters you've never heard of doing things that we've never mentioned before. Just so that because we're starting in the middle, guys. Like all the, but believe us, there's a story world that's already figured out. We promise. And I've just never seen that done well. I don't even care if Jack Kirby did it. That wouldn't have been the reason that the story would have been compelling. Is to just trust me, bro. The story world's really super rich and deep, and we already wrote the encyclopedia. So I don't know why. I just don't like. We didn't talk about those pages, and there's probably a reason for that. You know, I really think that you got to build up. You can have a super story, like a encyclopedic, like Tolkien-esque kind of story world, but you don't have to visually depict that for a third of the issue, I think, in order to, nobody's like, chewing their fingernails, like hoping that the story is going to be super complex. They're hoping that it's going to be good. And, and there are good moments, I think, in the dialogue and in the narrative portrayals in this, but it's not because you alluded to complexity. It's because you alluded to really interesting, compelling kind of you know relationship moments.
So well read. Maxwell Lord was also in this story. So I know just just to throw that out there. What were your final thoughts for New Gods number 2?
Yeah. Of all the storylines that were here, I had a lot of trouble finding one that I quite enjoyed, other than the Karok Death Speaker, frankly, and that's only
Mhm.
meant to foreshadow something that's happening much later. And there was a speckling, as Matt C. Pointed out, of good dialogue here and maybe some interesting character development, but where a lot of the attention was spent didn't enthrall me. It frankly, I think, was filler. I think more could have been done with less, quite frankly. And I don't think that there needed to be so many things introduced here. It would have been better to just spend some time on one or two of the elements, make sure they're well established, make sure you've hooked the reader before moving on to other storylines that you want to have later in the series. Unless there's just so much to tell that it was necessary to do all of this, it didn't make for a very good read by having it structured that way.
Thank you very much for checking out the video. Subscribe, like, and stay tuned for more.